All right, so the last histology part of this circulatory system unit is going to be the lymphatic system. And so the lymphatic system is this associated system that drains and monitors the fluids that bathe our cells. And that fluid, which is going to return to the circulatory system, is going to be moving through this lymphatic system. And we've learned about lymphatic cells, the B and T cells, and so this is the system that allows these cells to monitor our fluid, our body fluid, for non-self antigens. And so one of the main organs of our lymphatic system are the lymph nodes. And so this figure here, this is something I pulled off the internet. This is an example of a lymph node, and this is allowing us to see an entire lymph node under the microscope. And so for this particular lab, there are a few features of the lymph node that you're going to be able to identify. And so I'll use this figure just to give you an overview, and then we can look at some of the other slides to look more closely at some of these features. And so again, the idea of this lymph node is there will be lymph fluid that is moving through these very small spaces or sinuses of this lymph node. And as this fluid is moving through these very small spaces, it's going to be exposed to a bunch of lymphocytes, very small immune cells that are able to recognize these non-self antigens and initiate an immune response. And so if you think about what's happening here, it's like a big funnel, right? So fluid is going to be entering this lymph node throughout all of this outer surface. And this fluid is going to be moving through these small little clear spaces, these sinuses. And it moves through, again, it's going to be exposed to the various cells that make up most of this lymph node, or lymphocytes. And as this lymph is moving through, eventually it's going to converge and leave this lymph node at a single vessel. And so these lymph nodes have different regions. They're composed of these two primary areas. There's an outer area, this area where you can find these follicles. And so these structures here, these ring-like structures, these are called follicles. And these follicles, you'll notice, tend to be on the outer area of this lymph node. And so this outer area that contains the follicles is referred to as the cortex. And so a lymph node is going to have the outer region, the cortex. You'll notice it's a lot more dense. It has a darker color because of all the cells. And these cells tend to be arranged in these structures called follicles. And we'll look at some samples of these in a moment. As you move towards the center of the lymph node, you move into the region called the medulla. And so this area that has very few follicles that becomes a lighter kind of pink and more airy space, this is the medulla of the lymph node. And then finally, in some of our slides you can see this, but you'll notice this little indentation area. This, if you think of this funnel or you think of a river system, this is where all the small little rivers are going to converge and leave. And so this structure here of the lymph node is referred to as the hilus. And the hilus is going to contain a space for blood vessels to enter, as well as this very large lymphatic vessel to leave the lymph node and move on back towards another lymph node. And so again, these major regions of the lymph node are the outer cortex. The cortex is going to contain the follicles, and then the inner medulla, and the inner medulla is not going to contain the follicles. And in some cases, you can really see where this fluid is going to converge and then leave the lymph node, and this whole region here, this whole indentation is going to be referred to as the hilus. And the last big structure that we can see here is this entire lymph node is surrounded by a capsule, a dense, a kind of irregular CT layer that surrounds and supports this whole lymph node. And so this outer area here, this kind of pink collagen-rich area, this is going to be the capsule. And so we have the capsule on the very outer edge, and then we start to see the cortex containing the follicles, then the medulla, and then eventually that would be these large vessels leaving the lymph node at this area referred to as the hilus. And so if we take a look at a figure from a slide in the lab, this is showing you a kind of more close-up look at a hilus. And so again, an idea here, here's this outer area, and it would continue around. Here we can see the cortex, the area containing these follicles, and same thing over here. And as we move in from the cortex, eventually we're going to be moving to this medulla. And again, here's an example of the medulla, this area that doesn't have the follicles, and it has these kind of stringy looking layers of cells. And as this is moving in, this fluid eventually is going to leave this lymph node at this indentation. And so this is a nice close-up of one of the hilus. This is the area of the lymph node where this large efferent or exiting vessel is going to leave. You'll also notice here, this outer area, this is going to be the capsule, that dense irregular layer, that collagen-rich layer. There are areas where it does extend down, right? And so there's going to be some of these areas that we're going to refer to as trabeculae. And these trabeculae are areas where the cortex dips down a little bit and often is going to then kind of separate a couple follicles. And so if we look here at this next figure, this is a close-up of one of those trabeculae. And so here outside is our cortex, right? That dense, irregular, right, kind of a pink, a lot of collagen with then kind of interspersed fibroblasts. And here you can see where this capsule is then going to extend down or dip down into the cortex region of the lymph node. And so this pink tissue, which should look a lot like the collagen-rich tissue we've been seeing so far this term, this is going to be referred to as the trabeculae. And these, as you'll notice, are much, much smaller than the hilus, right? The hilus was a large indentation of the whole lymph node. Here we just have a small little dip within the capsule that separates these two follicles. And so this trabeculae is going to be this extension of the dense irregular capsule down a bit into the cortex. It's going to provide some space for vessels. It's also going to allow now for this clear space or these sinuses to emerge. And it's actually through these sinuses and through these very small ones that this lymph is going to be moving through. So lymph, again, is this fluid that's going to be carrying potential antigens that our immune systems, particularly our lymphocytes, need to see in order to respond to. And so if we take a look here at these two follicles, this again is the cortex region, right? The outer area of the lymph node just inside the capsule is the cortex. And the cortex is going to have these very defining features, these lymph follicles. And you'll notice that these follicles, they have this outer purple, kind of dark purple area, and then they tend to have a lighter center. And this lighter center is referred to as the germinal center. And really what these structures are composed of are a bunch of lymphocytes, and specifically B lymphocytes. And so these lymph follicles, I'm going to go back a slide. Here we can see the outer component of that follicle, and then we see the lighter germinal center. This whole area is composed of B lymphocytes primarily. And these B lymphocytes, because of where they are, they're going to potentially be exposed to this lymph fluid. And if there are specific antigens that are non-self, then they would be able to potentially respond to the presence of those antigens and mount an immune response. And so again, we have the outer area, and then as this lymph fluid is moving its way through these small narrow spaces, it's going to be passing by these lymphocytes or these B cells. And as it moves through this area, these various cells have the opportunity to be able to identify and to respond to these antigens. And so the fluid is coming in and it's moving itself slowly through these small little clear spaces. And as it moves through these spaces, it's going to be, again, likely monitored by these lymphocytes. The spaces in the cortex, so the small little clear empty spaces in the cortex, is referred to as the cortical sinuses. Right, so sinuses in this case are referring to these small little channels for this lymph fluid to pass through. And so the sinuses of the cortex are the cortical sinuses. And those cortical sinuses, as they continue to move towards the center or the medulla of the lymph node, then become sinuses in the medulla. And so we call those medullary sinuses. And so again, here's another look of outside capsule, dense irregular. And then as we move in, we get into the cortex, and the cortex is where you're going to find these follicles. Here, the lighter area of a follicle is referred to as the germinal center. And this whole structure is primarily composed of B lymphocytes that are able to identify particular non-self antigens and respond to those. And so really what's happening here is this lymph fluid is being forced to move through these small little cortical sinuses. And as it weaves its way through these maze of sinuses, it's going to be coming in contact with potentially millions and millions of B lymphocytes. And as these sinuses move through the cortex, they're referred to as the cortical sinuses. And now as they move through the medulla, they now are called the medullary sinuses. And so this last figure here, this is really a nice figure of the medulla. We do not see those lymph follicles, right? We see these more kind of linear structures of lymphocytes. They're not arranged in those nice circular structures like we saw before. And all the clear space here would be the sinuses. This is where the lymph fluid is moving its way through. And because we're in the medulla, we would call these the medullary sinuses. Now, the name given to these kind of linear structures containing all the lymphocytes, these are the medullary cords. And so a term you'll see on your list, the medullary cords, this is just a supportive area where a lot of lymphocytes are arranged. Again, the idea is the lymph will move through these sinuses, and as it does, it's going to be passing between and around and through these lymphocytes. Again, the idea is the lymphocytes are going to be able to monitor this lymph. And so you can imagine all of our fluid, all the interstitial fluid that's bathing our cells, is going to be sent and returned to our circulatory system. And as it moves back towards our circulatory system, it's going to be forced to move through these very, very, very dense mazes, these lymph nodes, and that's going to allow our lymphocytes a greater chance of being exposed to these potential problematic non-self antigens. And so again, just going back to this very first figure, just to kind of review here, here's our lymph node. The outer area is the capsule. It's a dense irregular CT. There are some areas where this capsule dips down, and these little dips in here between these follicles, this is going to be referred to as the trabeculae. As the lymph is moving from the outer area through the cortex, it's going to be moving through these areas referred to as lymph follicles. Here we can see a nice follicle with the germinal center. And again, the follicles tend to be on the outer surface, which we're calling the cortex. And as that fluid is weaving its way through these really, really narrow sinuses, it's going to be passing by these lymphocytes. Again, the idea is here, if a lymphocyte identifies a particular antigen that is it compatible with, then it's able to start to divide and start to become activated, and that's going to be very important in our immune response. And as this fluid continues to work its way through, eventually it works its way into the medulla, and so the spaces here, these clear spaces, would be the medullary sinuses, and then eventually all this fluid leaves the lymph node in one large vessel, and that vessel is going to exit the lymph node in this region called the hilus.